By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing fast. Entire German units were surrendering, often without firing a final shot. Among them were soldiers who had not eaten properly in days, sometimes weeks. When the American trucks finally stopped, the German prisoners expected the worst. Most of them were thin. Some could barely stand. Their uniforms hung loose on their bodies, belts pulled tight just to keep their trousers up. A few men had wrapped rags around their boots where leather had fallen apart. Hunger had become normal. Real food felt like a memory from another life. They were marched into a temporary holding area, just a fenced field with guards and watchtowers. No barracks, no comforts, just mud, wire, and silence. The prisoners whispered among themselves. "Maybe soup," one man muttered. "Black bread, if we're lucky," another said. They had heard stories. Some said American camps were strict. Others claimed the guards were cold and distant. No one expected kindness. No one expected generosity. Then something strange happened. Instead of shouting orders, American soldiers began unloading crates. Not weapons, not equipment. Food crates. The Germans watched in disbelief as metal containers were opened. Steam rose into the cold air. The smell hit them first, and several men instinctively swallowed hard. Meat, fresh bread, something sweet. One prisoner actually laughed, quietly at first, then stopped himself, afraid it was a trick. An American guard walked along the line and spoke calmly. "Everyone eats, slowly, no rushing." The words didn't register at first. Everyone eats? As trays were handed out, hands began to shake. One German soldier stared at what he'd been given. Thick bread, hot stew, even a piece of fruit. He looked up at the guard, certain there had been a mistake. "This is for us?" he asked. The guard nodded. And in that moment, several men broke down, not loudly, not dramatically, but with tears they didn't bother to hide. Because for the first time in months, they realized something shocking. They were prisoners, but they were no longer starving. At first, many of the German prisoners didn't eat. They just stood there, staring down at the food on their trays as if it might disappear. A few men sniffed the stew carefully. Others touched the bread, testing if it was real. Hunger had taught them caution. Too many promises during the war had turned into disappointment. One older prisoner whispered, "Eat slowly. If you rush, they'll stop it." But the Americans didn't stop anything. They watched quietly as the line began to move again. No shouting, no threats, just calm voices reminding the men to sit, to take their time, to drink water. That's when the fear truly began to break. A German corporal, his hands trembling, took a small bite of bread. He froze. Then he took another. His shoulders dropped like something heavy had finally been set down. Around him, others began eating too, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. Some men cried openly now, not because the food was perfect, but because it was enough. Across the room, American soldiers noticed something strange. The prisoners weren't fighting over food. No chaos, no violence. Instead, they were sharing, quietly breaking bread in half, sliding potatoes across trays to weaker men. One American private muttered to his buddy, "They look like they haven't eaten in years." The buddy nodded. "Most of them probably haven't." An officer stepped forward and gave a short order. The guards immediately slowed the pace of serving. Smaller portions, more breaks. They knew the danger. Feed them too fast, and some wouldn't survive. So the Americans adjusted. Not out of orders from above, not from rules in a manual, but from watching human beings in front of them. One prisoner looked up at a guard and asked, barely audible, "Why are you doing this?" The guard paused, then answered simply, "Because the war's over, and you're hungry." That sentence spread faster than the food itself. By the end of the meal, the camp felt different. Still a prison. Still surrounded by wire. But something invisible had shifted. For the first time since their capture, the German POWs didn't feel like enemies. They felt like men who had survived. The next morning, the camp woke up differently. There was no shouting from the wire, no desperate movement, no men collapsing in the mud like the day before. Instead, the German prisoners stood quietly in line, more organized than anyone expected. Some even helped each other walk. But the American medics noticed something troubling. Several prisoners looked worse, not better. One man had fainted during roll call. Another was sitting against a fence, sweating heavily, barely responsive. A third complained of severe pain after eating only half his portion the night before. The medics understood immediately. Starvation doesn't end when food arrives. Sometimes that's when the danger begins. They called an emergency meeting inside a small tent near the camp edge. Officers, medics, and guards crowded around a folding table covered in notes and ration lists. "These men weren't just hungry," one medic said. "They were starving. Long term. Their bodies can't handle normal meals yet." Orders changed within minutes. Rations were adjusted again. Lighter portions spread across the day. Milk diluted. Bread cut thinner. More broth. Less meat. Every decision made carefully, quietly. The prisoners noticed. They saw guards counting portions with precision. They noticed medics watching them eat, checking faces, hands, breathing. Some Germans feared punishment again. Instead, a guard explained softly, "We don't want to hurt you by feeding you." That sentence stunned them more than the food ever had. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. An American sergeant walked through the camp holding a clipboard. He stopped in front of a German soldier who looked especially weak, barely older than a teenager. Without raising his voice, the sergeant signaled a medic. The boy was taken out of line and escorted to a tent. The other prisoners tensed. But an hour later, the boy returned, wrapped in a blanket, carrying a mug supported by two Americans. He sat down slowly, carefully, and drank under supervision. No punishment, no shouting, no disappearance. Word spread fast. "These Americans are watching us," one prisoner whispered. "Not like guards," another replied. "Like doctors." That night, the camp was silent again, but not from fear. It was the silence of exhausted men finally realizing they might live. And for the American soldiers, a realization settled in too. They weren't guarding enemies anymore. They were guarding survivors of something far worse than captivity. Days passed. The wire was still there. The guards were still armed. Orders were still given, but something fundamental had changed inside the camp. The German prisoners were no longer just being held. They were being looked after. Meals came regularly now. Small, careful portions at first, then gradually more. The men learned the routine. Sit, eat slowly, drink, rest, repeat. Medics walked the lines every day, stopping to check pulses, eyes, hands. Some prisoners gained strength. Others simply gained hope. One older German soldier, once a schoolteacher before the war, quietly kept count of days. He later said the moment he knew he would survive wasn't when the fighting stopped. It was when an American guard returned his empty tray and said, "You'll get another one tomorrow." No sarcasm, no threat, just certainty. Among the American soldiers, the experience left marks too. Many of them had lost friends in combat. Some had crossed battlefields still burning. Yet, here they were, serving food to men they had been trained to see only as enemies. One private wrote in his journal that night, "I never thought feeding them would be harder than fighting them, because feeding them meant seeing their faces, their fear, their relief, their humanity." When the prisoners were eventually transferred to longer-term camps, many turned back at the gate. Not to run, not to protest, just to look. They remembered the smell of that first meal, the steam rising from the pot, the hands that didn't strike, but served. Years later, former prisoners would speak of that place not as a prison, but as the moment the war finally ended for them. Not with surrender papers, not with orders, but with food placed gently on a tray, and the realization that even after everything, they were still human.